The night my husband heard voices coming from the kitchen at 2 in the morning, something finally cracked open in our marriage, and not in the way he expected. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to a Tuesday in February, the kind of February that makes you question why anyone ever settled in the Midwest. The slush was ankle-deep on the driveway, the sky was the color of dirty dishwater, and I had just finished replacing a cracked head gasket on a 2019 F-150 that belonged to a guy who'd been rude to me about my labor rate. My hands were cracked and stained even after 2 rounds of Gojo. I was 54 years old, I'd been running my own small auto repair shop for 19 years, and I had more torque specs memorized than most people half my age. I came home that evening smelling like engine coolant and bar and chain oil, and I felt, in spite of everything, pretty damn solid about my life. The house was mine. That's the part that matters, not ours. Mine. I bought it 11 years before I ever met Derek. A 3-bedroom ranch style in Cloverdale, one of those quiet suburbs where the HOA sends passive-aggressive newsletters about holiday lighting and everyone waves at each other from their driveways, but nobody actually knows their neighbors' last names. I put 20% down, refinanced once at a better rate, and had been paying my mortgage on my own since 1998. By the time Derek and I got married, February 14th, 20 years ago, which felt romantic at the time, and now just feels like a trap I walked into wearing good boots, the house was already as much a part of me as my social security number. Derek was charming back then. I want to be fair about that. He was a project manager for a mid-size construction company, made decent money, laughed easily, and looked at me like I was something worth looking at. Not a lot of men had ever done that. I was always the loud one in coveralls, the woman who could quote you a parts cost off the top of her head, who didn't wear makeup to work and didn't apologize for it. Derek said he loved that about me. 20 years later, I know he loved what it represented, a woman who could carry her own weight, which meant he could put his down. We had a good stretch, genuinely. The first decade was mostly fine. He never moved in officially. That sounds strange for a marriage, but we'd agreed early on that I'd keep the house in my name. He'd contribute to household expenses, and we'd keep our finances mostly separate. His idea, actually. And I'd agreed because I was proud of my independence and didn't want to complicate what I'd built. Now I understand that the arrangement suited him for reasons that had nothing to do with respecting my autonomy. The one truly joyful addition to our household wasn't human. His name was Captain, and he was a turquoise and white budgerigar I'd bought from a pet store in 2015, when I was going through a particularly rough patch with my back and spending a lot of evenings on the couch. Captain had an opinion about everything. He'd whistle at the TV remote, scream, "Okay, okay," whenever I raised my voice on the phone, and spent his mornings doing aggressive laps around his cage while I drank my first cup of coffee. Derek pretended to like him. Captain, for his part, bit Derek every single time he came near the cage. Birds know things. The trouble with the way Derek and I were built was that his mother was a character unto herself. Vivian was 71, sharp as a tack, and had been living alone in a condo in Naperville since Derek's father passed 8 years ago. She wasn't helpless. She drove, she cooked, she had more opinions about politics than anyone I'd ever met. But Derek had a guilt complex about her that ran about 40 feet deep. He called her every other day, drove out there every few weekends, and funneled money to her quietly in amounts I only suspected, but couldn't confirm because of how we kept our finances. I didn't begrudge him caring about his mother. What I begrudged was the slow creep of what came next. It started in November, 3 months before the February that changed everything. Derek came home from Vivian's with that particular look on his face, the one where he'd clearly already made a decision and was just working out how to present it to me. "Mom's having a hard time with the stairs at the condo," he said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table while I was reviewing an invoice for a brake job. "Her knees are getting worse." "She should talk to her doctor about PT," I said. I wasn't being dismissive. That was genuinely the logical first step. "She's already done PT," he paused. "I was thinking she could stay here for a while, in the guest room." I put the invoice down. Define a while. "I don't know, a few months, maybe longer, depending on how she does." I looked at him carefully. Derek had a face that could be very still when he wanted it to be, and it was still now. Derek, this is a 3-bedroom house, and I use that third room for my bookkeeping. I have filing cabinets in there, my computer. You could move the computer to the living room. I don't want to work in the living room. He nodded slowly, like he was being very patient with me. I figured we'd talk it through. We talked it through. For approximately 3 weeks, we talked it through, and every conversation ended with me explaining why a permanent or semi-permanent arrangement wasn't workable, and him agreeing in the moment, and then circling back again 2 days later with a slightly different angle. The guest room had its own bathroom, he pointed out. Mom was very clean, he said. She wouldn't be any trouble. And underneath all of it ran this current, quiet but unmistakable, that I was being selfish, that a good wife would simply say yes. What I didn't know yet was that his cousin Renee was already working on him. I found that out later, and I'll get to it. But in November and December, I just thought I was dealing with a husband who felt guilty about his mother and was pushing too hard. I didn't understand yet that I was being managed. Renee was 46, lived about 20 minutes away in the same suburb, and had never, not once in 20 years, been anything but polite to my face. She brought pasta salad to our 4th of July cookouts. She sent Christmas cards. She asked after my shop with what seemed like genuine interest. What I didn't know was that she'd had long, detailed conversations with Derek about my house, including whether it made more financial sense for Vivian to move in permanently and how that might affect things down the line. I found out later, from a screenshot a mutual friend sent me, that Renee had described me in a text message as the mechanic who thinks she runs the world because she owns some property. Some property. The house I'd bought at 32 on a mechanic's salary, alone, before I knew either of them existed. But January came and went with me thinking I was just navigating normal marital friction. Derek backed off the subject over the holidays, which I took as a sign that we'd reached an understanding. Captain serenaded us through Christmas with off-key whistling. I had a strong fourth quarter at the shop. A brutal winter is good for business when you specialize in preventive maintenance, and I felt cautiously optimistic going into the new year. Then February arrived, wet and gray and mean. The slush never really froze and never really melted, just sat there on every surface looking defeated. And on a Wednesday evening, the 7th of the month, I came home from work to find Derek sitting at the kitchen table across from Vivian, who was already there, already settled, with a large rolling suitcase visible in the hallway behind them. I stood in the doorway in my work jacket, holding my keys, and I looked at Derek. He looked back at me with an expression that said he was ready for this, that he'd prepared. She had a fall, he said, just a small one, but I didn't want to leave her alone. When did this happen? I asked. My voice was very level. I'd learned that trick from dealing with difficult customers. The calmer you sound, the more control you actually have. This morning, I went over to check on her and she'd slipped in the bathroom. She's fine, nothing broken, but... So you brought her here. Just for now. Vivian looked at me with the careful expression of someone who knew exactly what she'd walked into. To her credit, she said, "Diane, I don't want to be a burden. If this isn't a good time..." "It's fine for tonight," I said, because what else was I going to do? Tell a 71-year-old woman who'd just fallen to go back to her condo alone in February slush. I wasn't cruel. "But Derek, we need to talk." We talked. In the bedroom, with the door closed, while Vivian presumably sat in the kitchen, and Captain made suspicious noises from his cage down the hall. And that was the conversation, the one I'd been avoiding for months, where Derek finally dropped the careful, patient routine and said what he actually thought. "Who are you to say where my mother lives?" he demanded, his voice low but tight, like a wire about to snap. "She's family. She needs help. And you're standing there treating her like she's some stranger off the street." I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear, something colder than fear. "Because it's my apartment," I said. I caught myself. "My house. Derek, my name is on the deed. My name alone. That was the agreement we made." He smirked. It was a small smirk, barely there, but I'd been married to this man for 20 years and I knew every micro-explain on his face. That smirk said, "You think that matters?" "We're married," he said. "What's yours is ours. That's how marriage works." That is not how marriage works in Illinois, when one spouse owned the property before the marriage and kept it in their name throughout. He stared at me. Then the smirk came back, fuller this time. "You've been talking to someone." "I've been paying attention," I said. He shook his head slowly, like I was being dramatic, like I was making something out of nothing. "You always do this," he said. "You always blow things completely out of proportion and then act like I'm the unreasonable one. Mom had a fall. I brought her here. That's it. That's all this is." I opened my mouth and then closed it, because I'd heard that before, the smoothing over, the reframing, the "that's all this is." Every time I'd raised the subject of Vivian moving in, he'd done this. Made it sound like I'd invented the larger pattern, like each individual incident was isolated and minor, and my connecting them into something bigger was just me being paranoid or difficult, or as he'd said once in October, catastrophizing. I'd started to wonder, somewhere around December, whether he was right, whether I was the problem. I didn't say anything else. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and when I came back to the kitchen, I made Vivian a cup of tea and asked about her knee and behaved like a normal person, because that's what I did. I handled things quietly. I went to bed before Derek did, and I lay in the dark listening to the slush drip off the eaves, and I thought about that smirk. He expected me to be angry tonight and apologetic by morning. He'd seen it before. He knew my pattern: blow up, go quiet, feel guilty, smooth it over. Sometimes I'd even slip him some cash for something, some household expense I'd otherwise have let him cover, just to ease the tension. He expected that morning apology. He was probably already counting on it. But sometime around 2 a.m., he woke up to voices in the kitchen, and what he heard there was not what he expected at all. The voices were mine and Vivian's. I'd gotten up because I couldn't sleep, which was nothing new. Insomnia had been my companion since my mid-40s, when stress and hormones conspired to turn every night into a negotiation. I'd gone to the kitchen to make chamomile tea, and I'd found Vivian already there, sitting at my kitchen table in a quilted housecoat, both hands wrapped around a mug of something she'd made herself. She looked up when I came in, and neither of us pretended to be surprised. "Couldn't sleep either," she said. "Never can," I said. I put the kettle on and sat down across from her, and for a long moment we just existed in the same room without performing anything for anyone. And then Vivian set down her mug and looked at me with those sharp gray eyes of hers and said, "He told you it was a fall, didn't he?" I went very still. "Wasn't it?" She was quiet for a beat. "I slipped on a bath mat. I didn't fall. I grabbed the towel bar and caught myself. There was no injury." She paused. "Derek drove over in the morning. I told him what happened, and by the afternoon he'd packed a bag for me and put me in the car." I stared at her. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I told him I didn't need to come here. I told him twice. He said it would be temporary." She looked down at her mug. "I'm not sure he meant that." The kettle started to whistle. I got up and made my tea and stood at the counter for a moment with my back to her, just breathing. I was 54 years old, and I had spent 20 years being managed by a man who was very good at making each individual thing seem small and reasonable. And suddenly, I was standing in my own kitchen at 2 in the morning, understanding that his mother, the woman I'd been quietly resenting for 3 months, was not his accomplice. She was another piece being moved around the board. "How long has he been talking about this?" I asked, turning back around. "Moving you in here permanently?" Vivian looked at me steadily. "Since October." October? He'd been telling me, "We'll talk it through," since November, but he'd already made up his mind in October. And then I thought about Renee and the text message I hadn't seen yet, and I thought about the way Derek had smirked at me in the bedroom. "You think that matters?" And something in my chest went from cold to very, very clear. That was when I heard the floorboard creak in the hallway, the one just outside the kitchen door, the third board from the wall, the one I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. Derek was standing there in the dark, listening. I don't know how long he'd been there. I looked at the doorway, and he stepped into the light like he hadn't been eavesdropping at all, like he just wandered out for a glass of water. "Couldn't sleep?" he said, pleasant as anything. "Go back to bed, Derek," I said. He looked at his mother. Something passed between them, not a conversation, just a flicker, and then he looked at me and his expression settled into that careful neutrality again. "Just making sure everyone's okay," he said, and went back down the hall. Vivian and I sat there in silence for a while after that. Then she said quietly, "You should talk to someone, a lawyer, before this goes further." I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night. The next morning was a Thursday. I called into the shop and told my lead tech, Marcus, 28, knew engines the way some people know music, had been with me for 4 years, that I'd be in by 10. Then I drove to a diner 2 towns over where I was sure I wouldn't run into anyone I knew, ordered coffee and eggs I didn't eat, and made a phone call I'd been circling for months without letting myself actually make it. Her name was Patricia Olson. She'd been recommended to me by a woman in my Thursday night book club, which Derek had always called "your little book thing," with a particular kind of smile, who had used her for a divorce 2 years earlier. Patricia was a family law attorney in Oak Park, efficient and unsentimental, and her assistant got me in for a consultation that same afternoon. I sat across from Patricia in her office, which smelled like printer toner and very good coffee, and I told her everything. The house, the deed, the date of purchase, our financial arrangement, the 20 years, the guest room, the suitcase in the hall, and the smirk. She took notes and asked precise questions, and at the end, she leaned back in her chair and said, "The house is yours. Illinois is not a community property state. Premarital separate property, maintained in your name, without commingling. You have a strong position." He said, "What's mine is ours," I told her, "because we're married." "He's wrong," she said. "Flat, no drama, just fact. Now, do you want to talk about what your options look like going forward?" I told her I wanted to understand everything. She walked me through it. Divorce proceedings in Illinois take a minimum of several months, often longer when property is contested. But since the house was clearly premarital and separately titled, it was unlikely to be divided, though Derek could attempt to argue contribution if he'd paid for significant improvements or maintenance out of joint funds. She asked me about that. I told her our finances were largely separate, that I paid the mortgage and utilities from my own account, and that Derek's contributions to household expenses had been inconsistent and informal. She said I should gather documentation, mortgage statements, utility bills, any records of payments in or out. I already had most of it. I was a business owner. I kept records like other people kept grudges. I drove home that afternoon with a folder of notes and a referral for a real estate attorney who could do a title search and confirm current standing on the property. I'd paid $247 for the consultation. It was the best money I'd spent in years. Derek was home when I got there. He was in the living room watching something on TV with the sound down low, and Vivian was in the guest room with the door closed. He looked up when I came in, and I could see him scanning me for signs of what kind of evening this was going to be. "Where were you?" he asked. Not accusatory, just asking. "Running errands," I said. I went to the kitchen and started making dinner. Pasta, nothing elaborate. I listened to the sounds of the house, the TV murmur, the faint whistle from Captain's cage where he was telling off his own reflection, the tick of the heating vents, and I thought about what I was going to do, and in what order. That night, Derek came into the kitchen while I was cleaning up and said, in the tone he used when he was trying to sound reasonable, "I think we should talk about making Mom's situation here more permanent, just as a practical matter. Her condo lease is up in April." I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on the dish towel. "April," I said. "That's 6 weeks away." "So it makes sense to start thinking about—" "Derek," I said, "your mother is welcome to stay here while she gets back on her feet. That's always been true. But her moving in permanently is not going to happen. This is my house. My name is on the deed, and I'm going to need you to understand that I'm not going to change my mind about this, no matter how many times we have the same conversation." He looked at me. The smirk started to form, and then something in my expression stopped it. I must have looked different than usual. I must have looked like someone who'd spent the afternoon in a law office. "You talked to someone," he said. "I told you before," I said. "I pay attention." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're making this into something it isn't." "What is it then?" I asked. "Tell me what it is." He didn't answer. He went back to the living room, and I heard the TV volume go up a notch. I went to the small desk in the corner of our bedroom, the one I'd always used for personal paperwork, and I opened the bottom drawer where I kept a fireproof accordion folder with my important documents. I pulled out the original deed to the house, the one with my name on it, Diane Lynn Kowalski, no one else's name anywhere on the page, and I looked at it for a long moment. Then I took a photo of it on my phone and emailed it to Patricia Olson with a note that said I wanted to move forward. I was still sitting there when I heard Derek on the phone in the hallway. Low voice, the careful kind. And then I heard him say a name that made the back of my neck go cold. "Renee," he said, "we need to figure this out. She's not going to make this easy." I sat very still and listened, and that was when I found out just how long this had actually been planned. I stood very still in the bedroom doorway, my hand on the frame, listening to my husband talk to his cousin about my house. He wasn't shouting. That was the thing about Derek. He never shouted when he was being truly dangerous. His voice was low and even, the way it got when he was calculating rather than reacting. I heard him say that I was being difficult. I heard him say that the April lease deadline was firm and that they needed to get ahead of this. And then I heard him say something that turned the cold clarity in my chest into something harder and more permanent. "If she won't do it voluntarily," he said, "we look at what our options are. Renee, you know people. There are ways to establish that a property has been treated as marital for years. Contributions, improvements, that kind of thing." A pause. Renee talking, her voice too faint for me to make out. "I know," Derek said, "but I'm telling you, she's not going to budge on her own, so we need to think about this differently." I went back to the desk and sat down. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me. I picked up my phone and opened the voice memo app, and I pressed record, and I set it face down on the edge of the desk closest to the door, which I had left open 2 inches when I came back in. I don't know what made me think to do that. Maybe 19 years of running a business had taught me that documentation is the difference between being right and being able to prove you're right. He talked for another 11 minutes. I timed it. When he finally came to bed, I was lying with my eyes closed, breathing slow and even, and he slid in beside me and was quiet for a long time before he fell asleep. I lay there in the dark thinking about the word contributions. I thought about the one bathroom renovation we'd done 4 years ago, new tile, a walk-in shower, about $9,000 total, which I had paid for entirely out of my business account. I had the receipt. I had the contractor's invoice. I had the canceled check. I kept everything. I emailed the voice memo to Patricia Olson at 6:15 the next morning, before Derek was awake, with a subject line that said, "Additional context, please advise." She called me back within the hour. Her voice had a new quality in it, a focused kind of energy that hadn't been there the day before. "This changes the picture somewhat," she said. "Not the property law itself. The house is still yours, that's solid. But his stated intent matters. He was discussing a legal strategy to contest the property. That's relevant if this goes to court, and it's relevant to your timeline." "What do I need to do?" I asked. "First, get a title search done today if you can. I'll give you the name of someone who can turn it around quickly. Second, I want you to make absolutely no changes to your living situation that could be characterized as establishing joint tenancy. Don't add his name to any accounts. Don't take out any joint home equity line. Nothing like that. Third, and I want you to think about this carefully, do you want to move forward with a divorce filing?" I looked out my kitchen window at the gray February sky. The slush was still there. It was going to be there for weeks. "Yes," I said. She told me what to expect. The filing itself would happen within a few days. Derek would be served, which would be uncomfortable, but necessary. Illinois required a 6-month waiting period for a no-fault divorce, and given that we had no children and the property question was relatively clear-cut, The process could potentially resolve in 6 to 9 months if he didn't contest aggressively. If he did contest, it could go longer. She was honest about that. I appreciated it. I want to tell you that the next 3 weeks were manageable. They were not. They were the strangest, most suspended weeks of my life because I was living in my house with my husband and his mother while carrying the knowledge that I had already set something irrevocable in motion, and neither of them knew it yet. I made dinner. I asked Vivian about her knee. I went to work and talked to Marcus about a transmission rebuild on a 2017 Silverado, and I came home and sat at the same table as Derek and watched him operate with total confidence that he was winning. He tried twice more to have the practical conversation about Vivian's permanent residency. Both times I said, calmly, that we would figure it out. I gave him nothing to push against. He seemed to interpret this as softening, which made him more relaxed, which made me feel something I can only describe as the opposite of guilt. Vivian and I had one more real conversation during that period. It was a Sunday afternoon, Derek out running errands, and she found me at the kitchen table going through mortgage statements and putting them in order. She sat down across from me without being invited, which I had come to understand was just her way, and she watched me for a moment. "You're getting your paperwork together," she said. "I am," I said. She nodded. She didn't ask what for. "I want you to know," she said, "that when this is all sorted out, I'm going back to my condo. I already told Derek that. He didn't listen, but I told him." She paused. "I'm 71, not dead. I can manage my own stairs." I looked up at her. "I know you can." "He means well," she said, and then she stopped, and I could see her deciding whether to say the rest. She said it. "But he's always done this, decided what's best for everyone, and then arranged things until they agreed with him. His father did it too. I let it happen for 34 years. She looked at her hands. "I'm sorry I let him use me as the reason." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "You told me to talk to a lawyer." "Yes," she said. "I did." Derek was served on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after that February night in the kitchen. I was at the shop when it happened. I had timed it that way, deliberately, because I didn't want to be in the house. Marcus had the Silverado up on the lift and was explaining something about a torque converter that I was only half absorbing when my phone buzzed with a text from Patricia's office. "Service confirmed, 10:47 a.m. I put my phone in my pocket and went back to looking at the torque converter. He called me 4 times that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. When I got home that evening, he was in the kitchen, standing at the counter, and the divorce papers were on the table between us. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not the smirk, not the careful neutrality, not the patient reasonableness. He looked like a man who had just realized that the board he'd been playing on had different rules than he thought. "You filed," he said. "I did." "Diane," he stopped, started again. "You didn't even talk to me." "I've been talking to you for 3 months," I said. "You've been talking to Renee for longer than that." Something shifted in his face. "What does that mean?" "It means I know about the conversations you had in October, before you ever brought the subject up with me. It means I know what you told her you were planning to do." I kept my voice even. "I recorded your phone call, Derek, the one you made from the hallway after Vivian and I were up at 2 in the morning. I know what you said about establishing contributions. I know what you said about doing it if I wouldn't agree voluntarily." The silence in that kitchen was total. Captain, in his cage down the hall, chose that moment to say, "Okay, okay," in his small, bright voice, which under other circumstances might have been funny. Derek sat down slowly. He looked at the papers and then back at me. "You can't record someone without their consent," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Illinois is a one-party consent state," I said. "I was a party to the conversation. I was in the next room." I had looked this up. I had looked everything up. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I wasn't going to actually do it. I was just thinking out loud." "You were strategizing with your cousin about how to claim legal interest in my house," I said. "That's not thinking out loud. That's a plan." He didn't answer. "I want you to know," I said, "that I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing this because this is who we've become, and I don't think either of us should stay in it." I meant that. I had thought about it for weeks, and I meant it. The house is in my name. That's not going to change, and I think, if you're honest with yourself, you know that. He left that night to stay with Renee. He took a duffel bag and his laptop and his good coffee mug, and he stood in the doorway for a moment like he was going to say something, and then he didn't. I heard his car back down the driveway, and I stood in the kitchen and felt the house settle around me, quiet and solid, and entirely mine. Vivian moved back to her condo in Naperville at the end of that week. I helped her pack her rolling suitcase, and I drove her there myself because she'd taken a rideshare over, and I didn't want her navigating that alone. Her condo was on the second floor of a well-maintained building, and the stairs were 3 steps from the elevator she never used because she said elevators made her feel like cargo. Her knee was fine. It had always been fine. She hugged me in the parking lot before I left, which surprised me. We had never been a hugging kind of relationship. It was brief and a little awkward, and entirely sincere. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," I said. "Call your doctor about PT anyway, preventive." She laughed. It was a good laugh. I understood then that in a different version of this story, we might have been friends. The divorce took 8 months. Derek retained an attorney, not a particularly aggressive one, and there was a period in April and May where his lawyer attempted to make the argument about household contributions, citing the bathroom renovation and several years of Derek's payments toward utilities and groceries. Patricia responded with my complete financial records, every mortgage payment from my account, every major repair, the full history of the property from 1998 forward. The bathroom argument collapsed when we produced the contractor invoice showing the $9,000 payment from my business account. Derek had paid for a new dishwasher in 2019 and a fence repair in 2021, both reasonable contributions to a household, both totally insufficient to establish equitable interest in a property he'd never held title to. We settled in October. He got his personal property, his 401k, and a cash payment of $4,500, representing his documented contributions to household maintenance over the marriage, which Patricia had negotiated as a clean resolution rather than a contested trial. I kept the house. I kept my business. I kept 26 years of mortgage history in my name and a credit score that hadn't moved a single point through the entire proceeding because I hadn't missed a payment on anything, not once. Renee sent me a Facebook message in November that said simply, "I hope you're satisfied." I read it once, marked it as a message request, and went back to reviewing my shop's Q3 numbers, which were excellent. Marcus asked me once, around the time everything was finalizing, whether I was doing okay. He asked it the way he asked about engines, directly, without a lot of emotional garnish, just wanting an honest answer. I told him I was better than I'd been in years, which was true, and he nodded and went back to the fuel injector he was cleaning, and that was enough. Captain is still here. He turned 9 years old this past spring, which is a pretty good age for a budgerigar. They can live into their teens if they're healthy and not stressed, and Captain has always been constitutionally opposed to stress. He still screams, "Okay, okay," when I raise my voice on the phone. He still does aggressive laps in the morning. He still has opinions about the TV remote. He never warmed up to Derek in 20 years, and I have spent considerable time thinking about what that says. The house is quiet now in the way houses are quiet when they belong entirely to the person living in them. I refinanced again last spring at a better rate. My credit score, unblemished, got me terms I was proud of, and I used part of the equity to finally fix that creaking floorboard outside the kitchen, the third one from the wall, the one Derek had stood on in the dark, listening, thinking he was the one gathering information. I think about that a lot.